Kia ora tātou. My name is Professor Brad Jackson from Victoria University of Wellington. I just want to thank Alessandra and all the organising committee for the invitation to be able to speak with you this afternoon. And also, as a visiting professor at the Open University, this is a topic that I've been able to explore, and I've really appreciated the support I've received while I've been here. Now, what I'm going to focus on in my talk is the power of place in public and political leadership. And basically what I'm going to argue is that place is something that we take for granted, we occasionally acknowledge, but we do not bring to the forefront of our concerns. Now, I was ably assisted yesterday with the wonderful field trip that we took to the House of Parliament and the Palace of Westminster. And if there was any example of a compelling sense of place and its influence that it has on political but also public leadership, I don't think you could find a more powerful exemplar. For those of you who had not been to the House of Parliament before, I'm wondering the way in which you think about political and public leadership, particularly in the United Kingdom, how that would have changed because of that visit. The basic setting by the Thames in the capital, but also within the Houses of Parliament, this very careful orchestration and use of pace, the separation of monarch and democratic leadership was really quite powerful. So that's essentially my argument. What I'm going to do is in the context of thinking about leadership. I've been working on the heuristic framework that Keith Grint very helpfully developed when he identified 4 lenses of leadership, and I've humbly submitted 2 more lenses of leadership and made a change to one of those lenses. So essentially he argues that if we consider leadership, we need to think of it in terms of position, person, performance, and which he mentioned in terms of results, process, and the 2 lenses I've added are purpose and place. And I'm going to argue that these lenses actually work very closely together. My focus, though, for the rest of the talk is on this notion of developing the lens of leadership as place, which basically questions where leadership is created. And the image I'm showing here is of a marae, which is the primary meeting room for PUPOL or iwi, which are the tribes of Maori. And there are over 400 of these marae across Aotearoa, New Zealand, and they are essentially the primary place in which leadership is created within the hapō, within the iwi, but also between the hapō and the iwi. And the picture is essentially demonstrating it's a really important place and is recognised by all as the place to create leadership. Now, just in terms of this notion of place, the quote here is from Cresswell, but basically talks about the fact that place provides an opportunity, but also it also presents problems, because place is something that everybody can relate to and feels has a strong opinion about, that actually it's a kind of commonsensical term that's got rhetorical power, but it also can lead to a lot of misunderstandings, etc. And so it's interesting when you say it's a word wrapped up in common sense. As we already think we know what it means, it's hard to go beyond that common sense level to understand it in a more developed way. And I'm going to suggest this is going to be a key task for ourselves. What's interesting is if you basically take the quote there and replace place with leadership, it equally holds truth. So place and leadership are very popular, commonsensical, emotional, but how do we go beyond that in terms of our theorizing? Especially as in this collection edited by Chris Collins and his colleagues to the University of Birmingham concluded that there is no overarching theory of the leadership of place, and to date only relatively empirical evidence. So it shares a lot of the issues around public leadership, theoretical underdevelopment and thin empirical work that Barbara Crosby and John Bryson in their keynote highlighted as a condition within public leadership. One area that I think is important for us in terms of our theorizing and our empirical work is to go to the field of geography. And just gives you an example here. Agnew has basically helped define place by highlighting that when you're considering place, you have to consider the actual physical location, but also the material setting, the potential for social relations. So the way in which the Houses of Parliament, where they're physically located, and then the actual material buildings that have been created. And then the much more human social process, which is building this notion of sense of place, which creates a subjective and emotional attachment. And one of the key tasks of leadership is actually to help create the shared sense of place too. So in terms of thinking about the relationship between leadership and place, what I'm going to advocate and suggest is that we're probably best to think of it as a dialectical relationship. And so essentially leadership, if you like, helps to define a sense of place, but is in turn influenced by that sense of place. And it's very much always happening in a kind of constant way. Now, what I'm going to do is to give you a number of ways in which that relationship, dialectical relationship, is manifested. And so I'll kick off with this notion that we can think of how leadership is created from place. And again, I'm going to be referring to Maori tikanga, which is a philosophy of leadership. And essentially at a PUPOL, when you bring various groups of individuals together from different iwi and tribes, you are encouraged to offer your mihi, which is essentially an overview of who you are. Now, what I want to do is just to address here two particular questions that you're asked to reflect upon and share with your colleagues. And the first is actually describe what is your mountain, the name of the mountain that is centrally important to you. And related to that is this notion of what is your river. So you have the masculine mountain and the feminine river, which are really important ideas of defining who you are. Now, when I first came across this, I found this quite challenging, but I've concluded that my home county is Leicestershire, and Beacon Hill, which is the oldest rocks in Europe, is my mountain, and the River Soar, when it meets the Grand Union Canal, is my particular river. Now, what I offer to you is, have you considered what your mountain and what your river is? And the whole idea is that becomes an important base, in addition to your genealogy about who you are and what kind of leadership do you wish to create. Now, another way we can think of this relationship is leadership because of place. Now, back in February, I had the honour of accompanying my father on his 80th birthday back to Malta, where we used to live 50 years ago to the year. And what was really struck was, if you look at the history of Malta, it is so critically influenced by where it is. Most specifically in geopolitical terms. It is right in the heart of the Mediterranean and has huge strategic importance, and that's been widely recognised for a whole bunch of, whether it's the Arabs, the Turks, the Knights of St John, etc., and of course more recently in the Second World War. And that has demanded a particular form of leadership that is widely celebrated through the award of the St George Cross for the kind of heroic leadership that was demonstrated by the people of Malta in the Second World War. Would like to highlight here that frequently where you are, particularly in terms of the seismic tectonic location, can pose a number of really serious physical challenges, geological challenges. And I just wanted to use Christchurch, the garden city of New Zealand, as my example here. As you're probably aware, is subjected to 3 major earthquakes and over 2,500 tremors. And what's remarkable is the response, the initial response in terms of leadership to help the citizens of Christchurch. The student army of 3,500 students spontaneously came together and mobilised to help the citizens through social media. And also the Farmy Army, basically farmers throughout the South Island and the North Island, came together to support in an immediate leadership reaction. But in a more organic, longer term response has been attempts by various groups who have spontaneously decided to rebuild in great chunks of the city that have been basically physically removed through demolition, to create spontaneous zones of activity. So dance-a-thons, a memorial to the 184 victims. So we can move from response to place to this notion, probably more classically how we think of leadership is this notion of leadership for place. 3 weeks ago I arrived in Scotland, and Nicola Sturgeon, the leader of the Scottish National Party, announced the intention to hold a second referendum. And this, is a very sort of powerful notion of leadership, leading for Scotland, which may or may not be contrasted for a backdrop of the post-Brexit Theresa May's the leadership against place, this notion of against Europe. Now, I recognise that could quite easily have switched these round. I could have put a Union Jack in front of Nicola Sturgeon and gave that as an example of leadership against place, and I could have put a Union Jack here with Theresa May and said this is leadership for place. So there's some ambivalence there around that. Now, just this last weekend, my sister and I went to visit the UK City of Culture in Hull, and for a lot of people there's a sense of, wow, that's an unusual location for a city of culture. But actually it made so much sense when you go there, just how the whole city has got behind and how proud they are in terms of featuring their city and this enormous repertoire of cultural activities, etc. And the discussions that I had with the volunteers and the citizens and how powerful this is in terms of mobilizing and reigniting a place that had obviously fallen on incredibly hard times. And just to see the power of an organising idea and this notion of leading with the place versus on the place or behind the place too. There is this sort of question that actually some leadership is powerfully recognised because it is done without place. And this is an area of contention, obviously, because this notion that we can create virtual places. But actually, these particular initiatives have done a lot to actually bust places, actually work through the constraints of place. And arguably with the UN and the European Union, they have been very powerful in terms of being able to break down attachments to place, but have they been able to replace that with a powerful global attachment to place, which may in fact be one of the problems in terms of being able to create a sense of mobilising leadership. About 4 weeks ago I was in Bristol, where I was a university student, hadn't been back for 36 years, and I was just hugely impressed with this gentleman's work and those around him, Marvin Rees, the first elected mayor of Bristol, to create an inclusive city, to try to create this notion that there is one Bristol for everybody, and to see it being recognised as being one of the best places to live in the UK just a couple of weeks ago. And finally, we're in Milton Keynes, and it's really, I think, really fitting to acknowledge this notion that actually frequently a task of leadership is to create a new place. And in particular, we've just celebrated the 50th anniversary of Milton Keynes, which is a city that was created as a new town. It's now a new city by geographers. And this is the kind of thing that happens when geographers and planners get involved. And what's been remarkable here is that in contrast to those people who don't live in Milton Keynes, I've just been struck. I've probably had about 85 conversations with residents and citizens here in Milton Keynes, and just this incredibly strong positive attachment they have to this particular place. And the role that the Open University, with its mission, as Steve mentioned earlier, to open up a place for study, for learning, etc. And this sort of symbiotic relationship between Open University and Milton Keynes. So look, in terms of the three key things I would like us to ponder, what I'd like to highlight is this. The first thing would be to question and challenge you to say the extent to which you are actively considering place in your research, in your teaching, and in your development work. How big a role does place play in your thinking? Related to that, what I'm going to basically suggest to you is to think about, if we were to foreground place at the centre of our thinking about leadership, how might we start to think about leadership in different ways? But earlier today, Barbara and John talked about this notion that we're quite thin on context. If we were to foreground not context but place, into our consideration of leadership. How might we start to see leadership, and also more importantly, how might we start to develop leadership? And my colleague Rob Worrell has done a very fine PhD which has examined various attempts to try to develop place-based leadership. So to finish off, I'd also like to reflect on a wonderful, memorable trip I made to the Isle of Skye. On St Patrick's Day, I was reading an obituary about this gentleman, Professor Donald Macaulay, and this was an extract from one of his most famous poems, and I'd just like to read it to you because I think it really epitomises the power of place. In the poem he says, "It would be unthinkable to deny that my attachment to this land that divides my tether and my freedom is as fast as the limpet on the rock and as the lichen on the stones." So I think he does a very powerful job of actually talking about leadership or place as a source of opportunity, of freedom, but also as a source of constraint. And I think also along those lines we need to think about the ethics of place as a resource and place as a contrast. Now, in closing, it is indeed an honour to be here at Milton Keynes at the Open University for this conference, but I'm going to offer an invitation to another place. This is in our capital, Wellington, New Zealand. The School of Government, which I'm based, will be hosting the 2019 IRSPM conference, and consider yourself all invited. I appreciate your attention, and I look forward to discussing the power of place in public and political leadership. Thank you very much.